Oh, here we go. This is them on the moon. We're watching Jordan Peterson Exodus series. They're talking about, I think they're talking about one of the commands in Exodus where if the dude has sex with a virgin that's not his wife, he has to make her his wife, etc. So that's what we're at. And I got a ton of McDonald's and I'm going to freaking smash it. Go.
Something approximating permanent relationship. And my sense is that even though the technology has enabled us to prevent the ultimate consequences of the act, that hasn't, I don't believe that mitigates the seriousness of the interaction. Mm-hmm. And I think the fact that
he's talking about birth control and sex.
Lost that has damaged intimate relationships almost beyond repair by making the part of them that is most significant emotionally and physically into something that's now as trivial as the lightest of entertainment. I don't think it's done us well, and that obviously...
What's up, gangster? We're watching Jordan Peterson. Love you. This is super interesting.
It's quite a conservative position in the political sense, but everything I see going on around me seems to point to...
Conservative or rational? I'm not being cute. Why is it conservative? Conservative might be prescriptive, but what you've described, I read over and over in left-wing sources, in progressive sources, how many depressed young women there are in the culture of our what is it called again? The
hookup.
The hookup culture.
Yeah, right.
Very few people would say that this has benefited women.
Mm. Well, I also see in the left-wing culture there's this strange splitting of attitude towards sexuality. And so on the one hand, there's this proposition that every possible variant expression of sexual desire and action is not only permissible, but to be celebrated in a mandatory manner. Mm-hmm. But simultaneously, every single interaction that's even vaguely sexual between a young man and a young woman is so pregnant with danger, so to speak, that it has to be reduced to an explicit contractual arrangement before it can even be undertaken. And so I think the fact that both of those exist, those tendencies exist on the left simultaneously, the left being that part of our political discourse that tends toward the breaking of arbitrary constraints, that's an indication that there's some underlying set of regulating principles that's been violated. You get an excess in libertinism on the all sexual proclivities are to be celebrated front, and this simultaneous legalism that emerges, because that does put young women in the in uncomfortable situations that are extraordinarily hard on them. So you get questions arising, for example, well, can a young woman give consent to a sexual interaction of any sort if she's intoxicated by alcohol? And it isn't the right-wingers who are bringing up that issue fundamentally. Yeah. It's the left-wingers, and their answer is, well, no, absolutely not.
That's a contradiction of tectonic proportions
absolutely.
within that worldview.
What it isn't a contradiction with, though, is this.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not reciprocal. This is this is saying that if I don't see here an equal and opposite commandment. If a woman entices a man to sleep with him, then she's
forced to marry him. Right?
No, this is the view here is that men have an absolute responsibility not to engage in commitmentless sex, and that to do so is to take or do something that is not reciprocal, and you know. So conservatives who want to point out these hypocrisies in the left should have to grapple with whether they are prepared to speak a kind of truth to power to men and say, this is intrinsic to your masculinity, is to take responsibility in this regard.
There's that famous documentary that came out recently, What is a Woman? And there's actually a biological answer to that question. There's a multitude of them, but one of them is, maybe you could say this, that's the principle of the biological reality, is that the female is that sex which takes primary responsibility for reproduction and bears disproportionate weight in doing so. That's what constitutes female, and that's true right at the level of sperm and ova. And it propagates, it's fractal. And so the reason it's the man that's taking advantage here is because the price he'll pay for it is nowhere near as high as the price she'll pay for it, either emotionally or conceivably practically. And so it is fundamentally his sin, right? And I think it's very much...
The confusion in the young, I mean, so I work in a very odd kind of college. It's a good one. But we figured out that the kids don't understand much about sex. And so we started offering a course called The Theology of the Body. And it is the most popular course on the campus now. And, you know, we're having to recruit half the faculty to teach it. Because,
using the teachings of John Paul II?
Yeah, such things, you know. In other words,
yeah.
it's... they understand sex is very consequential, right? It's a big thing. And in what way is it a big thing? And how should you, because they want it, they're human. What is its purpose? And all of that, right? And it's not enough to say, because like we're talking about details here that are almost romantic, because the preciousness of a woman, we teach the young men, don't foul that. That's a wonderful thing, and they listen. It's good for them.
Conservatives like to talk a lot about the hatred of men and the diminution and the problems in the education system. And they're completely right to do so. But we really have to ask, I mean, to what extent some of it is a consequence of the abdication of fundamental responsibilities?
Yeah, well, I think it's not only an abdication of fundamental responsibilities, it's also a diminution of the pleasure principle itself, because I don't believe that it's unreasonable to make the presumption that there is no more sacred act than sexual congress in some fundamental sense. And then what that means is that to diminish that to the status of light entertainment is to take the thing in your life that could be among the highest and to make that nothing but that which is casual. And that means there's no increment on the hedonic side at all, quite the contrary. And I would say I think part of the evidence for that seems to be that more and more young people aren't having sex. They're not engaging in relationships. While they're not having sex with another person, I mean, pornography use is rife, although even there's now evidence that among young men, the proportion of young men who have zero sex, which includes even the use of pornography, has started to climb up dramatically. And so it could easily be that we put ourselves in a situation where making sex as freely accessible as possible and as casual as might be imaginable has actually demolished its hedonic utility as well as its integration within a broader set of moral constraints.
This may be very obvious, but if you take your view, which I agree with totally, there's a way towards that, and this is safeguarding. In other words, the young man who's done that hasn't gone through the betrothal and the dowry and all that sort of stuff. So it's a protection of the very ways that the Jews saw you had to approach marriage.
Isn't there also a sort of philosophical, anthropological paradox that some of the most animal aspects of human life are also the most distinctively non-animal at the same time? So, for example, the meal. No other animal has a meal. And they feed, but they don't have a meal together. So for us, the meal, it's no accident that in great religious traditions, a meal has profound symbolism. The Eucharist is one that springs to mind, but there are many others, of course. Exactly. This is the sacred. And isn't it also true with sexual relations that this is at the same time the most animal, and yet it's a point where we distinguish ourselves from all other animals, and it's precisely, I think.
Well, I think that's an extremely wise point, also because it is the case that it's easy for the for the pull of our animal nature to entice us into a state of profound self-consciousness and shame.
Oh, it's just so
And
spicy.
that frequently happens, and I think it happens more often, to women who sleep around casually. And we could extend that to women who sleep around casually when they're intoxicated by alcohol and wake up the next morning and think, well, just what the hell did I do? And the shame emerges. And then you might say, well, what's the antidote to that shame? And it has to be perhaps that the pull of that animal nature has to be balanced by the sacralization of the enterprise. And that is the way, and that's the way out of the
I'm just realizing this panel is like full dudes. I wonder if there's any chicks that are like Exodus or biblical experts that would be good on here. Curious, I can't imagine. I don't know if I've seen one. Like a biblical ancient scholar woman.
shame. And
Not saying there isn't one, but I haven't seen one.
hypothetically, when you read about sexual utopian communes, for example, what's lurking in the background consistently is this idea that we could just, wouldn't it be wonderful if we could just dispense with our shame of nakedness and with our sexual shame? And the proper response to that might be something like, well, you can't dispense with it. The best you can do is integrate it into a subsidiary structure and elevate it. And it's through the elevation that the shame is eradicated, but not as a consequence of the mere dispensation with shame, which isn't, I don't think, unless you're psychopathic, I don't think it's possible.
One little additional thought.
Use fuckers.
I have spoken on campuses by sheer coincidence on some occasions, not most, but on some. It was Sex Week, which virtually every American campus has. I assume Canadian campuses have as well. And the campus is sort of drenched in sexual discussions, exhibitions, et cetera. And
I'm naive. I never heard of Sex Week.
well, you're at Hillsdale.
You're at Hillsdale, yeah. There's no sex
Hillsdale
at
has Sex
Hillsdale.
Week, yeah. But if Hillsdale has Sex Week, invite me. And it was a little depressing, actually, and I think it became clear, I'm certainly not prudish on the matter, which sadly one always has to add when one discusses sex, which is a tragedy in and of itself. But in any event, I'm just thinking, and this is a wild thought, would the average student on an average campus be happier if there was a Bible week or a sex week? Just in terms of happiness.
Sex.
So, I would also like to point out on the clinical front, just for the sake of argument, that there are markers of antisocial personality. And so that would be a proclivity towards the exploitation of others, the criminal exploitation of others. And that's a pretty stable pattern of behavior in human beings. It tends to last across the life course. It's very difficult to moderate with any psychological or sociological interventions. And there's a cloud of symptoms, patterns of behavior and thought that are associated with criminality, exploitative criminality. Predatory parasitism is the most extreme form of criminal proclivity. And one of the hallmarks of antisocial personality is multiple early sexual partners. And so the criminal types tend to engage in short-term mating strategies, and what that means is that they don't integrate their drive towards sexual gratification into any subsidiary structure. There's no long-term commitment to themselves or to other people. And I think that's very interesting that is a hallmark of antisocial personality, because it makes you wonder then if the group of persons who is pushing hard for a kind of naive sexual libertinism on the grounds of hedonism, if that's also not expressed, under what circumstances that's also not an expression of this same kind of callous exploitativeness that's a hallmark of antisocial personality. It's a perfectly reasonable technical question, because the more civilized people, the ones who are farthest from criminal behavior, are those who are more likely to engage in stable, long-term, monogamous relationships. Mm-hmm. And that's clear. That's another example of this bottom-up propensity, right? There's a biological reality there too, because you might say, well, the biological reality is that we're propelled by our our lust, the biological drive. But it's way more complicated than that. There's also a drive towards the integration of sexuality into a higher order pattern of being that's much more stable and much more likely to be reproductively successful, for example. So, psychopathy.
Dude, this is so freaking spicy, dude. I'm dying.
3% of the population. It's not a great reproductive strategy. It works better than it's better than not having sex at all. But it's not a good, long-term, stable reproductive strategy.
Can I ask about the next verse, 17? If the father refuses to give the maid over in marriage to the man, he has to pay money according to the dowry of virgins. What's going on there?
Well, it means that she is still not forced to marry him. He entices her, he has to marry her. But what if the family refuses? And almost all of history, in every civilization until the modern, the family determined your spouse. So she's not forced to marry the man. Mm-hmm. That's what it says.
And the money is as if...
But he still has to pay a penalty.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. 22:18, and let's do 22:18 and 19 together. Sure. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, and whosoever lieth with a beast shall surely be put to death. So, anyone want to tackle the witch?
Oz had a good insight on this, and maybe you should want to show how they relate to each other.
I got it from the rabbis and Leon Cass.
Yeah, cool.
In other words, again, your idea that the death penalty is not for everyone, that's important here. But Leon Cass says, we've come from Egypt, and we're going to Canaan. And both of them destroy the boundaries. So you're made in the image of God. You are God-like, so you're not an animal. All you said about that is right. You're not an animal. But you are God-like, but you're not God. Now, the Egyptians were ones who destroyed the boundaries upwards through the mastery of technology and rationality. And the Canaanites were the ones who destroyed the boundaries downwards. So the Egyptians...
Explain how did they do that?
The Canaanites?
How did they do that?
The Canaanites?
It's in that book you're talking about. What?
Yeah, through wild sexual frenzies, Dionysian festivals, and so on.
So a sinking back into unthinking
animal
nature.
Irrational, and so on. In other words, the boundaries are there because we're made in the image of God, and one way we try and break them is through the mastery of technology. We become gods. You think of Yuval Harari and people like that today. And what you're describing, the hookup culture, is the opposite. You destroy the boundaries downwards and just indulge our animal nature.
When you say technology, you mean embalming and...
Well, in this context, presumably it would be sorcery is an attempt.
I mean, the desire to control the world
in a godlike way through power. Yeah.
And then remember, Moses' opponents were sorcerers in Egypt.
So the idea would be that it's two verses that are related to each other. One which is, do not make yourself like a god and try to control the world through power, but then also do not become like an animal and join yourself with an animal. And it's explicit, right? Don't have sex with animals, but it also brings about just the notion of don't let yourself fall into that animal state at the same time.
And why would you associate specifically the prohibition against allowing a witch to live? Are you associating
not
that
a witch. John should come in here. No, this is the Egyptian sorcerer who is the secret arts
They
of
are
technology.
related, though. You're right.
But it's important to say...
Both destroy boundaries.
But it's important to say, I mean, this is maybe a little bit of a tangent, but for people who watch and will have been told the worst aspect of history, Christian witch burning is very much misunderstood by most people. In fact, witch burning was a pagan practice. It wasn't just something that you find in the Bible, but witch burning was a Roman practice. And in fact, in the transition into Christianity, witch burning was prohibited. We never find any witch burning in Constantinople. And witch burning is prohibited in the West. For example, Charlemagne made a funny statement. He made it into a joke. He said, if anybody burns a witch, they will be burned alive. And so it's only in the very early modern times that witch burning comes back. So
Why is that
16th
funny?
Century. Sorry?
Why is that funny?
Well, it's funny because it's like saying, if you burn a witch, then the consequence will fall back on you. It was trying to make an irony out of the situation, because they actually said that witchcraft was nonsense. And the early Christians thought witchcraft was just hocus pocus. It was total nonsense. And it's only in the 16th century into the 17th century that witch burning comes back. And
The dude on the left just zoning out. Jonathan right here, zoned out.
mostly through secular courts.
bored.
The Catholic Church actually did not engage with the hammer of witches and all of the kind of crazy stuff that was going on in the European world. And so the Enlightenment folks, they projected witch burning back into the Middle Ages when it was in fact something of their own time.
So I understand Oz's point about technology, and I'll just mention that C.S. Lewis says that in the early Renaissance, late medieval, there was a contest between magicians and science, and they wanted the same thing. They wanted to control nature. They wanted to overcome God, and that magic was impotent and science was strong, and so it replaced it.
This is Keith Thomas's thesis, I think, isn't it?
But I think this double drive, mastery and merging, is so strong today. And you know, the rationalist, secularist, man as God, and on the other hand, the merging.
No, you're right.
No, it's very interesting
Destroy
way of
every
conceptualize
boundary.
the
No binaries.
Yeah, well, that's a degeneration into chaos on the one hand,
Exactly.
and an
And I think
elevation
this is
into a
where
kind
we
of
are today.
rigid technocracy on the other. Yeah, and we do see that playing out in our culture with the increasing proclivity of globalist utopian leaders
Exactly.
to adopt a top-down Tower of Babel approach, and also the insistence that we merge back into an undifferentiated nature on the hedonistic side.
Exactly.
So instead of, that's a chaos, excessive chaos and excessive order problem
Well, this is
as
what
well.
C.S. Lewis called the abolition of man in, I think, in one of the
This dude's voice is crazy, dude.
works of the 20th century. It's a rather small text, but it is a but it's I think a prophetic
Sounds like a vampire.
work.
And you read it in light of this, of the boundary issue that Oz is laying forth.
Yes, I mean it's a pronounced critique of relativism and subjectivism. So it starts off with a reference to Coleridge, and it's a passage taken from a school book, a textbook
from the
at
early
the
1940s,
time, exactly for the 1940s. I think they've actually discovered which textbook it was, and Coleridge is describing the appearance of a waterfall, and criticizing the one observer who says that the sublime waterfall is pretty, and Coleridge makes the point: no, this is an error. And in the textbook that Lewis is criticizing, the view is, well, of course this is absurd because we merely project our feelings onto the universe. There is no objective reality about it in the way that Coleridge was claiming. Now, this is Lewis's starting point as a critique of a society that has lost a sense of objective order, has lost a sense that the facts of the world are suffused with values and objective values. And he sees that as leading, on the one hand, to this sort of deracinated subjectivism, but also at the same time an obsession with technology and control and a destruction of the sense of the human. So hence the title of the book, The
Don't
Abolition
you think
of
we are
Man.
even more radical today? So relativism, emotivism, but constructivism, it's an explicit assault on creation.
No, it's more than an assault on creation, because the consequence of that subjectivism is not only, as far as I can tell, the inevitable demolition of the sacred order, but also the demolition of the scientific order.
Of all order, absolutely.
Right, but it's so interesting because it's a branch of, you could think about it as an errant branch of atheistic materialism, or maybe its logical conclusion, and it clearly poses a threat to religious traditionalism. But I think that it's becoming increasingly clear that it imposes an equal threat to the integrity of the scientific endeavor as such.
That's
right, and that's so
explicit.
interesting that both of those are happening at the same time.
That's explicit in the novel that C.S. Lewis names as a partner to abolition of man, because what are these scientists at this evil institution, what do they turn to? They turn to magic and demons, because science too can't give them everything they want.
22:20, he that sacrificeth unto any god, save unto the Lord only, he shall be utterly destroyed. That brings us into a discussion of sacrifice, and I think this line is interesting to me because there's a pragmatism about it that's outside of the legalism. So you might say, well, if you sacrifice to another god, you should justly be punished. But there's an implication here, I think, that if you sacrifice to the wrong god, you will be punished. And the reason for that, in part, is that you sacrifice by working, by sacrificing the future, by sacrificing the present to the future. That's really the definition of work. Or by sacrificing what's only selfish to the broader community. That's a sacrificial gesture. And it has to be sacrifice in relationship to a goal. And then you might say, well, if you make extremely diligent sacrifices to the wrong goal, in some sense, you're worse off than not making the sacrifices at all. And so maybe that's reflected in the social norms. You should be punished for sacrificing to the wrong
Can I
god.
offer
But it's
a powerful example of what you're saying?
Go,
a few
Dennis.
years ago, the daughter of an EU, European Union official, a German major figure in the European Parliament, I believe it might have been the German Parliament, I think it was the EU, was gang raped. And it was by foreigners. But she was so committed to diversity and the non-judgment of any foreigner that she said it was Germans who gang raped her.
right,
Her
I
own
remember
rape.
that.
She sacrificed the truth of her own rape to that false god.
Holy shit.
22:21. This is an example of the broadening of the law.
You guys missed it, but yesterday Peterson was telling this story about this lady who was in the Middle East on a trip, and some dude was like, "Hey, you want to ride home?" And she said yes and got in the car. She was like going back to her hostel or whatever. And he takes her out in the woods, or not in the woods, out in the desert, takes her out in the middle of nowhere and says that he's going to rape her. And he says, because he was abused so bad when he was young. Anyway, so he freaking strips her down. And when he gets on top of her, she hugs him and tells him that she loves him. And he broke down crying and didn't do it and took her back. Took her back to the house. Isn't that freaking crazy, dude? Peterson had that lady that happened to in his practice, I think. He was telling it yesterday. I was like, holy shit. Anyways, sorry, back to the video.
In a fundamental manner, and so part of the moral revolution that's part and parcel of this revelatory structure. Thou shalt neither vex a stranger nor oppress him. So there's the idea of the universality of the law. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Then that's extended down to the poor and those who are powerless. Ye shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If thou afflict them in any wise, and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath shall wax hot, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless.
The people who dump on the Bible should have to answer where else there was a law that you must not oppress the foreigner, the stranger.
Foreigner, the widow, the poor. It's a pretty nice list there. And that
But
this is
especially the stranger.
Yes, especially, absolutely. Because this, in the anthropological literature, that general proclivity for tribal communities is to call themselves humans. And everyone who isn't in their tribe isn't human. And so they don't fall under the same law at all. They're not even of the same kind. Well, kind means kin. Kind is K-I-N with a D on the end of it. Why would the law extend to those who are not of your kind? And so you see a glimmering, well, more than a glimmering here of that. You see an injunction that in some fundamental manner the stranger is entitled to the same protection as your own kin. Yeah, that is, it's almost impossible to understand how revolutionary that is.
It's the invention of humanity, and it provides the conceptual structure and foundations for modern notions of human rights, surely, including Enlightenment notions.
Right. Another argument for the divinity. I just have to throw that in.
Yeah, well, it's at minimum an argument for the emergence of something that looks like an implicit universal moral order. And distinguishing that from the divine is no easy thing, even conceptually. So, and I mean, it's really hard on atheists, I would say, a line like this, because it's like, well, is this something you believe? Do you buy this? Why exactly would you extend the protection of the law beyond your kin? Where does that impetus come from? That's a very tough problem to sort out. And it's also a great set of lines to push back against the narrative that this ancient book is somehow fundamentally the expression of an oppressive patriarchal spirit. It's like, well, it doesn't look like it, not here. These are pretty harsh words. If you inflict them in any wise and they cry at all unto me, I will surely hear their cry. So the patriarchal God of the Old Testament is putting himself firmly on the side of those victimized by the unfair
and there's
administration of
interesting
power.
eye for eye in the structure of this, where it's like, if you oppress the stranger, the widows, and the fatherless children, then your wife will become a widow, and then your children will be fatherless.
Dennis, what do we make of the command that for which the Israelites are punished to kill all the people in the Promised Land?
You mean that they will die before they get into the Promised Land? They will die in the wilderness?
Well, no, like King
the
Saul
ones that were
is punished because
He didn't slaughter the enemy.
kill them all.
Oh yeah. Well,
Holy shit! He just put him in the hot seat, bro.
Questions in the last couple of days.
You guys are tough. I have a different view of post-Torah Old Testament. I believe that much of it is divinely inspired, but I don't believe that it emanates directly from God as I do the Torah, which is a traditional Jewish view. It's not my idiosyncratic one. So problems that you will bring from the book of Joshua or Judges, for example, and there are, I don't always have an answer to, and it doesn't trouble me, because the net result, and I'll tell you why it doesn't trouble me. Any specific difficult act, like wipe out the Midianites or Canaanites, or in the case of King Saul, they're all specific to the moment. If the Hebrew Bible ever said, Jews, I want you to wipe out everyone that you ever fight with, all their children and all their wives, I would not be a believer and not at this table.
Well, there's another issue there.
That's why you get the hard questions, by the way. You can answer them.
That's relevant too.
Thank you. Yeah,
one of the
try.
things, so when I had my debates with Sam Harris, and this is something that Sam used to do, sort of a postmodern trick, but it's a good one, is to say that I make the case that there's an emerging moral order, let's say in the Old Testament. He says, well, you're just reading into that, right? It's just a projection. And I thought, well, it's not a projection. How do you tell the difference between something that you're just imagining and something that's really there? In a text, classic postmodern question, is there any meaning in the text at all? Well, there's a technical answer to that psychologists have developed, and the answer is something exists if you can measure it using multiple different measurement techniques that are historically separated in their development, so they're qualitatively different, and they all report the same pattern. And so your senses do that. You have 5 senses, and you think something's real if all 5 senses report the same thing. And often that's not even enough, because you ask someone else. But what you're trying to do is get multiple independent streams of of
The data.
revelation that point to the same thing. Well, you can do the same thing in a text, and your brother does this brilliantly in his book, The Language of Creation, because one of his techniques is to say, well, here's a pattern that I've pulled out of this text, and here's how this pattern replicates itself across 20 different texts that were written at a different time. And so the idea there would be that maybe the depth of the proclamation in the Old Testament corpus is proportionate to the proclivity for that pattern to be repeated across multiple texts. Because your point is, well, it just shows up once. It's particularized to a time and place. There is no implication that it's a universal law, either in that text or across a multiplicity of texts. You made the opposite argument with regard to the crime of murder earlier. So, and I think that's a good technical answer. It's like, well, how often is that pattern?
Honest technical
Yeah,
answer.
yeah, definitely. And I think there's a technical answer to it, is that if it's detectable.
What's up, Max? I think this is about 2 years old, maybe. It's on thedailywire.com. You have to pay money to watch it. But I'm reading the Bible right now, and it's very confusing. So that's why I'm watching this seminar. It's on Exodus. And the first, it says March 22nd, 2023 was this one. But the first one's on YouTube for free.
Through multiple means of measurement, then the probability that it's a mere projection is decreased radically. And Matthew does a great job of that in the text.
Yeah, these are completely rational principles of interpretation.
Right.
Yes,
They're perfectly
exactly.
plausible.
Right. Okay. So
That's why I call my commentary the Rational Bible.
So 22, 25 ends chapter 22 for our purposes. This is a complicated one because we're in a society now that charges interest. If thou lend money to any of my people that is poor by thee, thou shalt not be to him as a usurer, neither shalt thou lay upon him usury. The Mohammedan world, the Islamic world, has taken that, a similar idea, to an extreme. Their economic systems aren't reliant on the use of money lent at interest.
Which is true in Christendom until the Reformation.
Right.
In the Christian tradition, you are not allowed to lend with interest within the Christian world, and it's only Calvin, I think, who changed that.
Okay, and so
all kinds of ways around that, though, right?
Islamic finance has.
Yeah. Well, there has to be ways around it.
But the question is why? That's the question.
Yeah, Peterson's a freaking gangster. I feel like he's been getting a little weird lately and confusing to me, but he's cool. This series is freaking banger, though. I would definitely recommend it if you're interested.
Why was it important for the early Christians, even though people would always get around whatever rule you put?
Well,
and why is it
so
there
they wouldn't be
in the
mafia
text?
dons. It's like, pay me 25%, next week, or I'll break your legs. That's a bad extension of that property. And maybe if you can set up a system where that's constrained and regulated, then. But this is a pretty stark.
Yo, welcome, dude. Thanks for the sub. I got a new vlog coming out this week and a photo journal, so hopefully you could see that. And yeah, glad you're here, bro.
Seems like a stark prohibition. And so,
for loaning to the very poor, and not for those who will use the money you loan them to do a business with. The assumption is if they make money from your money, then that's a different type of interest.
So is
loan.
that why it is to any of my people that is poor by thee?
Yes, that's right. It's not a ban on loans.
Right, so it's a ban
only
on.
with regard to the very poor. Help them out. So basically, it's really an injunction for charity.
I see. So
that's
it's
really what it
don't
is.
charge people below the poverty line 30% on their credit cards.
Sounds right.
So I've been thinking about this quite a bit, honestly, and I don't totally understand it. But what I do understand is that the fact that we set that aside in the contemporary world, and the fact that we have set up an entire financial system based on credit, it seems to accelerate reality. It seems to have an effect on the way in which we live. Because what credit does is that you're borrowing from the future. That's what you're doing. You're saying, I don't have this now. I'm going to get it from outside of me, and I'm going to pull it to myself. And then what it does is it creates a strange wheel that seems to accelerate. And I think that the acceleration of the modern world seems to have something to do with credit.
Well, it has something to do with the efficiency of financial markets, and certainly the provision of credit. Well, it is greasing the wheel. I don't think anybody would dispute that. Your point is that there's a...
Yeah, the thing about this to me that's interesting and what I like is that not all these guys are religious, right? So it's like Dennis is like a religious Jew. Peterson, I don't think literally believes this stuff. Some of the other people, there's like an Orthodox Christian, there's like a scholar in the beginning of the series, they have a narrative screenwriter guy. So there's all these different perspectives on a religious text, obviously, but it's not all pure religious people talking about it. So you get like all these really interesting perspectives because there's like 8 dudes that come at it from different angles. So it's pretty eye-opening in my opinion.
Danger in that we're not contending with, that it's an artificial acceleration of the rate of transformation. We risk doing that to such an effective degree that we might not be able to cope with the consequences.
Because the way that states do it is particularly visible, right? It's like what you're doing is you're just putting your problem on the future. You're basically taking your problem, throwing it out, and saying, "Oh, we'll deal with this later." And so there's something about credit which has that structure.
To be clear,
Which I think about it in somebody who's irresponsible with credit. That's what ends up happening, right? It's like they borrow. It's like, yeah, I've got a car, I've got this, I've got that, and then all of a sudden it hits them. The way in which states do it seems to be playing over a longer period of time, but we can see the wall coming, and we don't quite know what it's going to look like when, financing of the debt is equal to the GDP of a country or something crazy like that, which is completely possible that it will happen at some point.
to be clear, there's not a prohibition against loaning and borrowing here. You're allowed to loan money, just not without interest.
Yeah.
And I take it what you're saying, Jonathan, is that for whatever benefits might be described on the other side in terms of efficiency and so on, I'm not persuaded there shouldn't be interest. What it does is it accelerates, it makes easier, it incentivizes borrowing, right? Because you might make money. It's got to be clear here that this is going to disincentivize borrowing, right?
What I mean by it accelerates is that it accelerates, right? It's like I borrow $5 and now I have to pay back $7. So I have to produce.
Yeah, bro, I feel you. And dude, I literally just smashed so much McDonald's. It's insane. And I have a stomachache.
More than what I needed in the first place in order to pay it back. So think about that cycle. If you make it into a system, it creates a cycle that just will necessarily accelerate.
Well, enormous service has been done on borrowed money and fortunes made. So I think Dennis's distinction is fundamental, right? If you live on your credit card so you can party more, that'll bite you.
I mean, I have a credit card. I'm just trying to understand why Christians would have banned this for 1,000 years.
If people borrow money to start businesses all the time, and they build a lot.
Yeah, I do a Sabbath on Mondays. So on Mondays, I rip McDonald's, but every other day of the week, I basically have these giant grilled chicken salads that I eat the same thing every day. And then on my Monday, it's my Sabbath, and I make music all day. I watch this, and I eat McDonald's.
For themselves that way. And bankers are pretty good at figuring out if they can pay the money back, and they bear the cost if they can't. So that, it's different than
usury,
running up your credit card bills, right?
And it's different from loaning money to people can never pay it back and enslaving them permanently as a consequence.
And Dennis.
Hey, oh yeah, I'm in Bali. Look. Oh wait. Sorry, hold on. Boop, boop. There we go. I'm out in the jungle in Bali for a couple months. Anyways, back to the video. Boop. How do I start it?
Says, according to the Torah, that if you loan money to people.
I'm not religious. I just wanted to try it because, like I said, I'm reading the Bible cover to cover, and just for the hell of it, because I'm curious about it. And then I've been learning about the Sabbath in this series and the point of it. And I don't exactly know. In Judaism, it's pretty hard because you can't work, you can't use electricity, you can't do all this stuff. So I'm not doing that, but I just disconnect from shit I don't want to do. I disconnect from the world to a large degree and just do what I want to do and just do what is fun for me, you know. So it's not religious. It's like an experiment.
You can't pay it back. That the poor people, you can't charge them interest. Because
Well,
in
that's
that
what it
case,
says. That's the law
in
we
that
just
case,
read.
it's not an investment, right?
Right.
But has there ever been a practice that Jews amongst themselves do not loan on
Well,
with
it's
interest?
fascinating you should ask. Well through the 20th century, one of the first things every Jewish community set up was called a Jewish Free Loan Society, where the poorest Jews got loans without interest. And that was what it was called, a free loan society. And it was understood that you don't take advantage of this to make money on the money we give you, that you need it to live. So as I said, it's essentially a charitable, but it's a beautiful thing. It's better than charity because it keeps your dignity. You didn't get charity from the community, you got a loan. So you have to pay it back. Charity you don't have to pay back. So there's a beautiful thing that charity is being called a loan in this verse.
Oh, that gives people the opportunity to engage in reciprocity, right?
Yep.
And anyone, the problem with the gift-giving charitable approach is that the drive to reciprocity is an extremely deep part of the moral foundation of human interaction. Everyone who's civil in the sophisticated sense, and anyone who isn't antisocial and psychopathic, feels a moral obligation when granted something to reciprocate in some manner, to set the scales straight. And I think part of the reason for that is we recognize that in the long run, across multiple interactions, the scales have to be balanced. It's incumbent upon to be a player who does that. And so there's remarkably sophisticated psychoeconomic experiments that demonstrate people's commitment to that deep requirement for reciprocity, even when they're extraordinarily stricken by poverty. In fact, they become more assiduous in pursuing that principle when it's difficult for them to reciprocate practically. So at least they have their morality, you might say, right? Even if they don't have the money. We'll go to...
Yeah, I'm definitely not reading the Bible to follow the rules of it, but I'm reading it because I'm curious and I just want to give it cover to cover, give it a chance. And I was raised religious too, but honestly, I think the Bible, as I'm reading it, what's happening is I'm less and less convinced it's literally true and more convinced that it's metaphorically true as I'm reading. But I'm only in like 2 Kings right now, so I'm not that far, but there's no way you could follow the rules. It's like, bro, the Old Testament covenant and the rules, it's like sacrificing goats and shit. It's crazy.
Exodus 23. I'll read a few at once here, I think, maybe 6 or 7.
Yeah, dude, in the Old Testament with the Sabbath, if you work on the Sabbath, you get stoned. So like, obviously I'm not doing it that serious.
Because they're excellent indications of the emergence of quite a sophisticated morality. It's certainly not one that's reliant on an immediate impulse for vengeance or on the expression of power. Quite the contrary. 23:1, thou shalt not raise a false report, nor put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. We discussed that to some degree.
Oh yeah, it's super hard to understand. That's why I'm watching this series, because I'm reading the Bible. I'm like, what the hell does this mean? But then these guys break it down pretty good. The Bible or any ancient text is a way to feel like those people who wrote it. The Bible or any ancient text is a way to feel like those people who wrote it feel like those people wrote it so it may give you the most rich info ever. I'm not sure if I understand what you're saying.
Yesterday, thou shalt not follow a multitude to do evil. Right, don't participate in a mob. There's a good one for the modern world. Neither shalt thou speak in a cause to decline after many, to wrest judgment.
What does that mean?
Neither shalt thou countenance a poor man in his cause. That's an interesting one. What does it mean? Just because the person's poor or rich doesn't mean that you alter
law
justice
against social justice.
Yeah.
That is it in one verse in the Bible.
Yeah, right, absolutely.
Social justice is you favor the poor in judgment. Justice is you do not favor anybody in
period.
Judgment. Period.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. That's Exodus 23:3. We should burn that on the back of our imaginations. Neither shalt that countenance a poor man in his cause merely because he's poor. Yeah, that's remarkably sophisticated. Or patriarchally oppressive, depending on how you look at it.
The former.
If thou meet thine enemy's ox or his ass going astray, thou shalt surely bring it back to him again, even if he's your enemy. If thou see the ass of him that hateth thee lying under his burden, and wouldest forbear to help him, thou shalt surely help with him. Thou shalt not rest the judgment of thy poor in his cause. Keep thee far from a false matter, and the innocent and righteous slay thou not, for I will not justify the wicked. And thou shalt take no bribe, essentially.
They'll break it down. They'll break it down.
Thou shalt take no gift, for the gift blindeth the wise and perverteth the words of the righteous. And so that's 8 laws there. Anybody have a comment on any of them or all?
Liakim Olrak. This is actually a banger series. I'm telling you, these guys are, I don't think they're right about everything. Like, no one's right about everything, but it's amazing to see all this different expertise. These people have studied this and lived this their whole lives in a lot of cases. And they all have different perspectives, and being able to see them kind of fight it out and all these different perspectives on this ancient book that's basically ran people's lives for thousands of years, and then see all these opinions on it. It's super interesting, like undeniably interesting in my opinion. So I paid for it. That's how they get paid for it. It's super interesting.
I love the way that we're starting to see now attached to the laws and the ordinances a sort of little explanations, not with every single one of them, but they're kind of unpacked. I mean, I was actually this struck me from the previous chapter, but the same applies to these verses too. But I'm thinking, this is verse 27 of the previous chapter. You've got to, you can't take the covering from anybody, because you can't take clothes from anybody, because what will he sleep in? And you can't do this because I am gracious. So it's unpacking the law. These are not just kind of brute edicts. They are understandable, and the law is a teacher. It has a pedagogical function for a society. It can shape its moral culture.
Right, and you're referring to the fact that these are legitimate unfoldings and differentiations of
I think I'm going to speed it up.
A set of principles, of fundamental principles.
The law
and they're
is
coherent in that manner.
They're coherent, and they're transparent. They're legible. They're open to reason.
Right.
They're not mysterious.
They have a logos.
Yeah, there's a clarity and a rationale.
So you're saying, James, that these are not brute dictates, but actually grounded in the goodness of God.
That's
so
right.
It's because God is gracious and generous and caring. That's why, not simply because He commands it.
Right,
That's
and
right.
Also, God wants
that
us
means
to
they're not.
understand.
Sorry, go ahead.
He's
That's
teaching us here. See, if you absorb this and the reason for this, it'll make you better more generally.
Right. And so that's a very different attitude than kind of a unthinking Rousseauian view where human beings are intrinsically good and it's only social order that corrupts them. This is an alternative view that says, no, there's a minimum set of necessary principles and punishments that have to be put in place so that people can be good and generous, like the spirit that is producing the law. And that also means that the law is not to be regarded as just the walls against fundamental drives. They're more like enabling, they're the enabling principles of the good itself.
It's like the point that Jonathan made yesterday about the importance of transformation and a kind of moral transformation, the transformation of one's character, and not getting too obsessed with what this law does or what this law prohibits and so on. It's really the idea that the law is a guide, it's a teacher, and once you grasp its underlying rationale, this context, I am compassionate, I am gracious, therefore you must be too. And once one learns that grace, learns that compassion, then as it were, the need for the law, it doesn't fall away completely, but as it were, it's fulfilled in some way and transcended.
It's not accidental that it's a body of laws, right? Because laws are something you embody, and that means that they are the patterns by which your spirit unfolds itself in action. And so you are being disciplined in a manner that shapes you in a particular spiritual direction. We could assume the laws are coherent. They stem from the manifestation of an underlying spirit that unites and that draws people away from tyranny, because that's obviously the narrative implication of the book.
Was that number 1, tell the truth unless it's a scenario where the harm clearly outweighs the good? Was that in the Bible? What they were reading? Thou shalt not raise a false report. Put not thine hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. I think that's just don't lie, period. I think the thing about tell the truth unless it's a scenario where the harm clearly outweighs the good, I don't think that's a thing.
Doesn't mean that places the responsibility of upholding certain principles on you, and that's enforced. But the point of that isn't so much to constrain and inhibit as it is to develop and facilitate. And the development and facilitation should be the creation of a new benevolent father out of an unruly child, let's say, so that that process can be transmitted down the generations. And I mean, one of the things you do with children, if you pay attention to them, is judiciously, encouragement is partly the judicious use of prohibition. It's like, no, you can't do that, kid. That's beneath you. It's truly beneath you. That has to come to a stop. It's not going to work out well for you. It isn't going to help you become the sort of person that I know you are and could be. And that does require judicious prohibition. But it's not the imposition of a tyrannical force against the creative, the creative spirit of the child. It's the pathway that creative spirit has to tread in order to become fully manifest.
Well, it is somewhat tyrannical, and I defend it. Love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. I am the Lord telling you to do this. And the reasons that the midwives did not kill the Jewish male babies that were born was because they feared God. And they, as I add, didn't fear Pharaoh. There is an element of quote-unquote tyranny to goodness. But is it
authority or backup? But you're using that rhetorically in some sense. I mean, you mean authoritative.
I do.
Yes.
So okay, and so we agree on authoritative.
Absolutely.
Meaning that there's an authority.
Yeah, but authority also includes the possibility that it's a coherent. Like it's authoritative in the sense that it actually constitutes the right way to be. It's not just like someone says do this because I said so.
Well, yeah, but we assume that God knows what He's saying. I mean, without that assumption, this whole enterprise is pointless.
It's authoritative.
We assume God knows what's best.
This is covenantal, not a dictatorship, because the people buy in. It comes from the Lord.
Well, yeah, they did. This was something that we raised tangentially yesterday. Did they buy in? So here's a beauty for you. From the Midrash, that is the Jewish philosophical tales of at least 2,000 years of age. God held Mount Sinai over the heads of the Jews and threatened to drop it on them if they didn't accept the Torah. That is an ancient Jewish famous Midrash, one of my favorites, because I can't imagine people saying, what a great idea, especially men, do not commit it.
Liak Molrak, I would... As far as I know, I think there's basically no good. A good reason to lie is insane. Like I feel like there's very, very, if you really dig into it and the philosophy behind why you wouldn't lie, talking to someone you know is dying and telling them they're going to be okay to give them hope. Yeah, don't do that. I would say do not do that. Give it to them straight. Like the idea that you should just tell them it's going to be fine and they're dying. Who would want that? I wouldn't want that. I mean, I think I'm of the belief that there's basically no good reason to lie. Sometimes there's a good reason to lie if you've lied so much and done so much wrong that you're in a position that you have no choice but to lie or die, basically. There's some choices like that where you might be in that predicament. But it's usually because you made bad decision after bad decision after bad decision after bad decision after bad decision, and then you're in a position where the best thing you could possibly do is to lie. But it's extremely rare, I think, and you have to be a real piece of shit or super unlucky to be in that situation. I go for never lie. That's my one rule, actually. In my Danny Suede ethics, like my what's right or wrong, I have no idea, except for I have one rule for myself, literally one, and it's do not lie. That's all, my only rule. So I'm definitely biased, but
adultery, man, sign me up. It's do not steal. Gee, I'm on board with that. According to a fantastic course on the history of the Catholic Church I listened to on recordings, the thing I remember best was he said how difficult it was for the Catholic Church to convert the Germanic tribes. They were the last ones. And you know why? When they said, so if we become Catholic, what do we have to do? Well, for one thing, you can't murder. You can't kill. And they go, what are you talking about? We're out. That's how we operate. We operate on killing. Of course, there's an element of a fear of God that has to take place.
I think you can have that while maintaining the notion of voluntary, I wouldn't say compliance, voluntary participation, because I think that I can agree voluntarily to cooperate with someone I know to be tremendously powerful. I can still agree with it voluntarily. And so you can still have that authority lurking in the background, and even the fear of that authoritative spirit, let's say, without that necessarily compromising the fact that it's voluntary.
If we had signs up on the roads, forgive me, Oz, I know I'll forget this. If we had signs up on roads, everybody agrees that there have to be traffic laws. No one would differ with that. But if we drop traffic laws or penalties for violation of them, and we just put up signs, drive carefully, or drive however your heart deems appropriate driving to be, it would be mayhem. I'm a big fan of a divinely based order of laws to make a better society. Nothing else seems to work.
We agree with the authoritative and where it comes from, but if you say tyrannical, you undermine.
I agree with you totally. I only used it
But
because Jordan did, and you meant to.
Sure,
yes.
make it my fault.
Yeah, no.
One answer to you're right, the medieval rabbis, I've read that too, but the opposition points out that the people buy into it in Exodus before they hear the details.
We will do and we will observe, right? Is that what you're referring to?
All the Lord says we will do.
And then they rebelled the rest of the Bible.
That's the reason for the explanations that James notices, right? In other words, he gives reasons. And so both things are in there, right? For the laws that are not good are harder to enforce. But all laws need to be enforced.
So the appeal in verse 9, 23:9, is both to, so it's authoritative, but it's also explicating a kind of a logic. It's appealing both to reason and to, well, empathy, isn't it? It says you shan't oppress the stranger because you yourselves were strangers.
Well, there can be a carrot and a stick
Right.
in a voluntary, authoritative relationship.
So the culpability of breaking that is not simply disobedience to the divine, but a kind of, there's an irrationality.
But Americans have not signed on to do not favor the poor in judgment, just for the record. On the people signing on to good laws, I wish that were true.
Well, that's the radical left, and they're totally opposed to this.
Yes.
That's right.
More opposed to this than they are opposed to anything else.
But
Exactly.
ask a college student. I would be next time I speak at a college, I'm going to ask for a raise of hands. How many of you do think that if there is a billionaire and a poor man in a court case, we should not favor the poor man?
That's a very good, very interesting thing to do. Do a Twitter poll and find out what people think on that. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. We're going to close with 23. There's about 9 or 10 verses here that have to do with something we already covered to some degree, which is the commandment of God to move into a foreign land and to wreak a certain degree of mayhem. So I'll close with that, and we can discuss that. I think we should probably focus on the interpretation that you laid forth before, the particularity of this commandment, and we should discuss it, and then we'll close for today. So this is 23:20. The narrative shifts gears. Behold, I send an angel before thee, speaking to the entire people of Israel, to keep thee in thy way, and to bring thee into the place which I have prepared. So that's the land of milk and honey, right, that the Israelites are journeying towards. Beware of him and obey his voice. Provoke him not. So the question is, what is this angel? For he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. But if thou shalt indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy unto thine enemies and an adversary unto thine adversaries. Conditions for success in battle. That's what's being laid out. For mine angel shall go before thee and bring thee in unto the Amorites, the Hittites, and the Perizzites, and the Canaanites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. Thou shalt not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do after their works, but thou shalt utterly overthrow them and quite break down their images. And ye shall serve the Lord your God, and he shall bless thy bread and thy water, and I will take sickness away from the midst of thee. There shall nothing cast their young, nor be barren in thy land. The number of thy days I will fulfill. I will send my fear before thee, and will destroy all the people to whom thou shalt come. And I will make all thine enemies turn their backs unto thee. And I will send hornets before thee, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, and the Hittite from before thee. I will not drive them out from before thee in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beast of the field multiply against thee. But little and little I will drive them out from before thee, until thou be increased and inherit the land. And I will set thy bounds from the Red Sea, even unto the sea of the Philistines, and from the desert unto the river. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and shall and thou shalt drive them out before thee. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. They shall not dwell in thy land, lest they make sin against me. For if thou serve their gods, it will surely be a snare unto thee. So I'll start this interpretation. And it seems to me, I would think about this psychologically, the idea here is that the proper orienting principles of the state and the psyche have now been established. And there's two injunctions. There's an injunction here and a promise. The injunction is, you bloody well better pay attention and abide by these principles. And then the promise is, if you do so, you'll be utterly unstoppable, even in war. And so, and I think, well, we can think about that practically. We know that morale, for example, is extraordinarily important feature of what might constitute the preconditions for victory on the battlefield. And so then you might say, well, what are the preconditions for morale? And that would be something like a unity that provides for cooperation, that controls and constrains anxiety, and that produces hope. It's something like that. And then you might say the proper ethic is going to do that. So
switch it from psychology to sociology. This is one of the classic texts on Judaism being countercultural. You know, Abraham, the first word is negative, leave. Your country, your culture, your kin. Balaam later says, I see a people who live alone. And you can go right through the Old Testament and see again and again they're called to be different. Not the worship of the pagans, not the ways of life of the pagans. This is a call to a countercultural community.
Well, now, how do you square that with the fact that God is simultaneously pointing out that these poor Amorites, Hittites, Perizzites, etc., are now going to be in serious trouble?
I think we have to understand it in regards, if you want to understand it in a way that's useful, maybe is the best way to say it, useful for us. The Church Fathers, I think, offer a very good way to see this, is you can understand it in relationship to the gods, that it's not just about the people, it's about the gods. God is basically saying, it's what we were talking about before. You know, God is the transcendent God. He is the ultimate good. And these other gods, they're forces of nature, they're tribal gods, they are fragments. They're fragments of what reality is. And God is saying, if you worship me and if you follow my commandments, then those gods will flee, and I will reinstate something which is the right image of how the world should exist. And so the way the Church Fathers would talk about it would be, that's what happens inside you, right? You have all these gods, you have all these idols within you, and if you turn your attention towards God, then you will be able to chase out the gods and the passions and the desires you have in you. And interestingly enough, he says, I'm going to do it step by step. And this, I think, Christ is referring to this when he talks about evacuating all the demons and leaving the house empty. You know, it's something you have to do little by little. You can't just, even in yourself, and you know people that have tried to do that. It's like, well, I'm going to stop smoking and drinking and all this at the same time. And then you're like, yeah, watch what's going to happen. You're going to be desolate very soon. And that the transformation has to happen in an organic, progressive. I really think Christ is referring to this when he talks about this idea of getting rid of all the demons and leaving the house empty. It's something that has to be done slowly and progressively.
Okay, well, I'm going to bring our discussion to a halt at that point. That's actually a very nice end point. We're at the end of chapter 23, so we can progress to 24 tomorrow. It's exactly on the 2-hour mark, so that's a lovely conjunction of time and content. And so thank you, gentlemen. Douglas, very good to see you again. To all of you who are watching and listening on the Daily Wire Plus platform and wherever else you can access this content, thank you very much for your time and attention. To the Daily Wire Plus crew who make this possible, onward and upward, and we go to chapter 24 and episode 12 tomorrow. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. So many young people don't get married, and many, even more than they, don't have children because they don't want to sacrifice their freedom and their independence and so on. But I just realized I have a new answer to all these young people, and that is, do you realize how much you're sacrificing if you don't get married and don't have children? No matter what you do, you sacrifice.
I will admit that I did not understand, actually, I think, what was going on with the tabernacle until I read Maps and Meaning.
Oh, Ben Shapiro pulling up. Holy shit. Oh man, that's gonna be crazy. Okay, join me next Monday. We're gonna get back to it. I'm gonna be watching this all week, but whatever. The thing is, I'm going here. I'll put this in the chat again. I'm going live on my music channel, Danny Suede. Right now, after this, I gotta switch my thing. But you can see my. Can I pin this? Pin. There you go. Going live on Danny Suede channel after this. So if anyone wants to pull up and hang out with me while I make music, I'll be making some happy music. And yeah. Well, this is my most viewers I've had on a live stream ever in my life. So shout out to Jordan Peterson for bringing them home, bringing them in. Before I log off of here, I'll show you what I got going on music-wise so you can have a little sneak peek. I just started like a teeny idea. Yeah, but I don't have to light it, but I don't have to tie my eye. Ooh, that's so good. I want to record that real quick. Don't worry about it. Don't have to learn it, son. Oh wait, wrong input. Go. It's a tidy man. It's a tidy. It's a cut in my eye. Ooh, yeah. It's a tidy man. It's a tidy. It's a cut in my eye. Ooh. That's a banger. Dang, I don't want to log off here because I have so many viewers, and I'm afraid they're not going to come to my next stream. I got 11 viewers. I never have 11 viewers. Anyways, I'm going to log off, and I put in the thing, if you go over to Danny Suede Music, Danny Suede channel, I'm about to pop on there with the live. Hopefully I could see one or two of you over there. That'd be sick. And we're going to get it. Thanks for watching. Peace out.